Women shouldn't wear pants? Is that the deal? Women shouldn't have short hair? Look at the woman on the left. The woman on the left works at the church. She has short hair. Look at all those pants. In fact, I don't see a dress or skirt. Goodness gracious. So. Hey y'all, welcome. Joffrey the Giant here. I am going to be reacting today, and reacting to a video that is nearly half an hour long, so buckle your seatbelts. This will be a long one. I am reacting to a video from NBC News called Christian Nationalism on the Rise. And it features my church, one of my pastors, my town, and I don't know what else. So I saw a little 4-minute, 20-second bit at the end of the nightly news, and I thought, well, is this it? You know, it was very, very indefinite, and things were simply said like, it's so patriarchal, isn't it? Yes, it is, without any backing it up, and I was very disappointed. So I'm actually really interested to see that this longer, more in-depth video came out. So I've seen little tidbits of this, but this is a full half-hour video with lots of different parties involved. So I'm interested to see how they get into it. Now, if you look up here, you can find other videos of mine on Moscow, on the church, on the so-called cult, on so much of the propaganda. So yeah, if you want to check those out as well, particularly after this reaction, then I encourage you to. And hopefully, whether you are a disinterested third party, or you're on one side or another of what honestly has turned out to be a lot of hostility here, like people are assaulted in this town. My own daughter recently had people yelling at her that she was a cult member from a truck on the street. She was walking back from work and people were yelling at her. I have friends who have had hands put on them. There is a lot of animosity and a lot of cult rhetoric. So let's see how they get into this in this video. And obviously you guys are figuring out where I am on this. I am a member of Christ Church downtown. So Pastor Wilson isn't my pastor, but I love him very much. And as I mentioned in other videos, I have been a member of CREC churches from this denomination, in several places in this country, and even in another country. Not in the Ukraine or Russia, but we have several churches in both the Ukraine and Russia, for example. Well, without further ado, we should get into this. The church and state is what's showing on the screen right now. Christian nationalism on the rise. Let's get into it.
Welcome. You have made it to episode 1 of season 5 of Meet the Press Reports. Thanks for being here. Theocracy. It isn't a word you often hear in American politics these days, but given the religious rhetoric coming from some Republican candidates this year, it doesn't feel as far-fetched or hyperbolic as it would have been in the past. Frankly, it feels possible. There are candidates embracing the idea that whatever the First Amendment actually says about the free exercise or establishment of religion, that this wall between church and state should actually come down. And not only that, these folks argue the wall was actually never supposed to be there in the first place. In fact, here's Lauren.
Okay, so already stuff to get into. I'm not going to turn this video into a video about church versus state. First, I will just comment that I kind of love that the word theocracy is being used. I've done a couple of videos about the word. And of course, they're using this word as just an automatically, like, if I say theocracy, then you are scared, right? So we're not going to even have to examine the terms. I say theocracy, theocracy is bad. We all know that. The second thing I'll mention is, he says, well, some people argue that that wall should never have been there. The wall, the way it is interpreted now, never should have been there. Now, I expect from having watched the shorter video that there's going to be a lot of, oh, these people want something old to come back. Nothing of the sort. The 1950s were terrible. As much financial prosperity as most of us might have been enjoying. There's no one wants to go back to the 50s. No one wants to go back to the 19th century. We want something new. Now, perhaps it is something new and scary. But the conception of church and state that I hold to and I believe is historic is that there is not a church that the state says is the state's church, right? So the church needs to be separate from the state in that regard. It has nothing to do with whether Christianity is the religion of the land or if the state is making laws that are biblical or Christian. Those are two very different things. Really what they're talking about is a wall between religion and state, which is an impossibility because human beings are all religious. The state becomes God in their setup. But let's continue.
Lauren Boebert. She's a freshman member of Congress from Colorado. She was speaking this summer to congregants. Here's what she said.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk.
She's not alone. The Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, the nation's 5th most populous state, said this to his supporters.
So much for this myth of separation of church and state.
That's right.
That poor guy. There was a lot of patriotic paraphernalia. I'm not necessarily a fan of that. That poor guy didn't get his day in court. He just gets quoted as so much for the separation between church and state. Love that. I will note that to say the church should direct the state is open to interpretation. And it's interesting that I don't know what her whole talk was, but it's interesting that she said direct. Because, certainly when the church speaks, politicians should hear, right? I am directed by my church leaders in a certain way of speaking, right? They can't just tell me what to do, but what they say informs my direction for sure. So it'd be interesting to know what she meant by direct. She didn't say order or mandate.
And that's the same position that Michael Peroutka, the Republican nominee for Maryland Attorney General, it's a position he's taken since at least 2014 when he called the separation of church and state, quote, the great lie. And he added, there can be no separation of God from government because he, capital H there, created it. That would have been news.
So again, this is the separation of religion from state is what he's talking about. In his mind, church and religion are the same thing.
To the founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, who was the first of the founders to use the phrase, the wall of separation metaphor, to describe the First Amendment's religious freedom protections. Other Republicans, though, are openly embracing, quote, Christian nationalism.
We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian, and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
Even the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade has religious overtones. It has been cheered on by conservatives on religious grounds. And in fact, it's actually led some liberals to look to the religious freedom restoration laws, many of them vigorously opposed over the last decade, to use these laws as an attempt to challenge these statewide abortion bans that are being passed around this country. So, as a country, we are entering unknown territory.
I will mention that I don't like the use of the term Christian nationalism. And as it's defined by several local pundits and leaders, I'm a fan of it. But I just don't like the use of the term nationalism. It allows people to play games like this guy is doing. Christ is king. Nations should submit to Christ as king. I do believe that. But, nationalism is such a loaded loaded word. But there's a perverse sort of rhetoric that people enjoy engaging in.
What is next? Where is this movement heading? My colleague, NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson, traveled to Moscow, Idaho. It's a blue enclave, small blue enclave, in an otherwise ruby red state that has been grappling for years with questions about the role religion should play in the public square and everyday life.
In northern Idaho's dunes of grains and grass, a battle without bullets over the direction of a town.
I believe that what's happening in Moscow is a microcosm of what's happening all across the country that started here maybe 10 or 15 years earlier than what's happening across the country.
So just an interesting note, apparently for Pastor Wilson to grant this interview, he insisted that he and his team be able to record the entire interview as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this is spun, and if the whole interview or highlights elsewhere from the interview reveal anything. I'm actually super interested to see how this rolls.
That is?
Well, just the radical division. I don't think our nation has been this divided since 1859. It's divided and it's inflamed. And that whole process, I think, began to be visible here a decade or a decade and a half before it became radically visible in the nation as a whole.
Pastor Doug Wilson leads Christ Church in what he calls a Cold War civil war.
Our rights come to us from God and not from the government.
Fighting in, of all places, a college town. Moscow, home to University of Idaho and just 8 miles from Washington State University, exudes a live and let live vibe.
One of the interesting things about Moscow is how these...
I love how they can just show a pride flag and say live and let live vibe and just think that that's an unchallenged thing.
two entities live side by side, and I mean literally. Right behind me, that's the offices of the Christ Church. And right next door is the headquarters for the local Democratic Party.
Okay. I don't know how often I'm going to stop this. We're only 4.5 minutes in. But there's a little bit of phrasing that shows some cluelessness. So often in mainstream media, there's just religious cluelessness. And religion correspondents seem to be religiously uneducated. Being educated about religion would tend to create more respect for it. But regardless, religiously uneducated. Calling it the Christ Church is super weird, right? It's, the weird way that old people will say the in front of things that are just a part of our everyday life, but still feel weird for them. You can tell that this is like I don't even know how to say the name of a church out loud.
From this former art house movie theater, Wilson leads his campaign to make Moscow a Christian town.
Idaho is a very red state. Moscow was historically a very blue dot in this red state. And so consequently, the fact that we've done this has been disruptive in the minds of some, but the feasibility of evangelizing in Moscow had to do with the importance of the university and the size of the town.
So in your version of a Christian town, would there be a place for non-believers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Would there be a place for same-sex couples?
But you mean legally?
Yes.
You mean like marriage?
Mm-hmm.
No marriage. But there'd be same-sex couples.
No marriage, even though it's the law of the land in the United States?
Just like Roe used to be, right?
Yeah, so no marriage even though it's the law of the land. Well, it wouldn't be the law of the land if that's what we're going down. But just kind of going back to the very first thing you said, I think it's very significant that Pastor Wilson talks about the evangelization of the town. Because there are all sorts of efforts underway. And by the way, having Wilson be sort of the flag bearer for this is quite legitimate. But whether it frightens you or pleases you, you should know that there are a lot of people of weight and of insignificance here and around the country, but who are working for these same things. But there's an evangelistic focus here, right? And then there's other work. There's work in education that is having an effect all over the world and blessing people all over the world. There's work in business. There's work in politics. But this is just regular Christianity expressing itself culturally. The focus is evangelistic. People will become Christians and will want to worship and worship in community the one true God. That's how it's going to happen, right? So it was interesting that one of the, I think the narrator said, a war without bullets, right? Because, any opposing worldviews, that's what it's going to end up being. And it's from the people who hate the Christian growth in this town that you hear rhetoric of violence. And by that, I don't mean them being violent toward us, although that has happened. What I mean is they talk like what we want to do is some sort of military takeover. It's evangelization, baby. That's what's frightening.
In my belief system, in our doctrinal stand, and what we believe the Bible teaches, homosexuality is not only a choice, but a sinful one. Yes.
It is a muscular, masculine-led vision of Christianity.
Scripture tells the man to provide, protect, and love. Scripture tells...
That actually is interesting, that she used the phrase muscular, because there was a movement, particularly strong in Great Britain, but in North America as well, in the late 19th century, called muscular Christianity.
The woman to honor, help, and submit.
Expounded on his show Man Rampant.
Men are going to be dominant no matter what you do.
And articulated in his blogs. This one saying marriage is a little kingdom and the husband is a little king.
A wife should be submissive to her husband, as Paul teaches in multiple places, yes. So a wife should be submissive to her husband.
Before I let Pastor Wilson continue here, this is one of those things that, those like pagan Christians, effectively, liberal Christians, should have stopped being Christians. I really don't get it, right? You read the Bible, and that's why there's a movement to say, ignore Paul, just listen to Jesus, except Jesus says some terrific and terrible things too. But, why are you still a Christian? You're clinging on to some, like, you want these traditions to back you up, but you don't believe it because St. Paul's words disgust you.
But in the blog post that you just cited, I made a special point of saying that the woman exercises authority over the selection of the one that she's going to submit to.
So when you say wives should be submissive to their husbands, does this mean, why shouldn't they be equal?
Well, because God created us a certain way. So we want to fit with the design.
Former Mayor Nancy Cheney says the community...
That's really interesting, and I suspect that that's an area where something might have been cut off, because in human worth, men and women are absolutely equal and have equal rights. In the economy of marriage, things have been ordained a certain way, and I am pretty confident in saying that Pastor Wilson had more to say on that topic. But it probably sounded irrelevant to them.
It has endured decades of Wilson's often incendiary ideas.
When some kind of outrageous statements were made early on about Southern slavery as it was, as a mutually affectionate relationship between master and slave, or saying that members of our LGBTQ community, trans people, should be exiled or possibly stoned, that catches our attention.
Wilson says he was misunderstood, rebutting the many controversies on his website, writing he does not believe in the death penalty for homosexual acts, or that slavery was a
And it's more than just a little thing like that. Like, just, there are academics that you could read that said the exact same thing that Wilson said. And would they be canceled today? probably. But in 2000, they wouldn't have been canceled. There was never an unqualified, slavery was, an affectionate relationship between masters and slaves. What there was a little bit of subtlety to this. Slaves, for centuries, had to create their own culture, and they lived as humans. Do we imagine that slaves never sang? Never had a moment of happiness in their families, despite all this stuff hanging over them? It's actually an affirmation of the human ability to overcome evil and evil circumstances, that people were actually able to live life and create culture. Was that how it should have been? No. But they were able to live their lives and build things despite the fact of chattel slavery, which means that human beings had human relationships, and that there was a lot more complexity than sometimes we are comfortable with.
Positive good. But the visible and invisible lines being drawn here and elsewhere across the country are setting off alarm bells for many faith leaders.
Do you consider Christ Church a church?
I don't.
Really?
I really don't.
Okay, I'm sure they're about to say who this is, but quite fascinating that this is a woman pastor. Yeah, so do we consider each other a church?
What is it then?
I see it as a dominionist cult.
There you go.
Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Stevens leads the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse.
Okay. Wow, Unitarian Universalist. Christianity is Trinitarian, right? So this is, surely they could have found some other liberal pastor. Most American churches would affirm that Unitarians are not Christians. Unitarians deny the Trinity.
Unity, we've got in the public square, I don't see them representing Christianity. I don't see them representing the values that I find in the Bible. I see them representing patriarchy. I see them fighting the culture war.
Stevens' position in that war is visible for all to see. A stained glass rainbow chalice. Wilson fights with the printed word. A prolific author, he's written dozens of books, all distributed by his own Canon Press. It publishes more than 1,000 different titles, half of which...
I won't address it in depth, but saying his own Canon Press is inaccurate.
Are books and materials serving hundreds of thousands of homeschool and Christian students nationwide. Wilson laughs off the cult accusation, but the former Navy man embraces culture warrior.
You can't have a naval warfare without ships, and you can't have tank warfare without tanks. And as I tell Christians all around the country, you can't have culture war unless you have a culture. Our tagline is all of Christ for all of life. So we want to be 7-day-a-week, 24-hour Christians in everything we do. And a distinctively Christian culture is forming here, and not reclusive and not cultic, but it's distinct.
So if you watch my video about the cult idea in Moscow, so not reclusive is an absolutely key idea. And it's not reclusive. First of all, we're part of a pretty large denomination, and people produce stuff that other thousands of people get into elsewhere. So it's not just in Moscow. Even if we just limit it to the CREC and churches in our denomination, it's not just in Moscow. In fact, it's international. And just today, I was setting up something in South America for people who are doing their own thing and have been doing it for 10, 15 years and want to connect with us.
In Moscow, Wilson and Christ Church have built a multi-million-dollar enterprise that includes a K-12 school, a publishing house, a college, and a streaming show. Pursuits that some worry will change the very character of this town.
What scares me is that he is making Moscow into a Wilson town.
Healy-Emerine mix.
See, this is the thing that these folks do. They focus on Wilson. You guys should focus on people like me, on the schmucks who have something to say and are building some stuff. I mean, Wilson individually did some absolutely fantastic things, particularly early on. In a sense, for example, he is the founder of Logos School, and he is the founder of New St. Andrews. But the thing is, other people are taking over the work, and what's more, and what is perhaps more frightening, other people are founding their own things. And 30 years from now, there's going to be a whole lot more that's going to have to be dealt with. Wilson's name is likely to be in this culture war here regionally a historical note because of how much is being done by so many others.
Is a former pastor.
What worries me is not that the stamp of Christ might be wrongly shoved down the throats of my neighbors here in Moscow, but that the stamp in the foot of Doug Wilson will be wrongly and is being wrongly crammed down their throats or standing on their neck. I think that his influence on this town has been despicable.
Aubrey and Wyatt Knickerbocker met 2 years after her family moved to Moscow, seeking a Christian town.
We found what at first we thought was a very welcoming community. There was something every day, something new, some sort of baby shower or something for the school. You get very swept up in all of it.
Until they heard this message from another pastor in the church.
Women should wear women's clothes. They shouldn't wear pants.
Shouldn't have short hair.
Shouldn't have short hair. Men shouldn't wear earrings. No one should have tattoos.
And then there was this, a psalm singing in the middle of the pandemic, protesting the...
Okay, so we're going to have to go back to, this is a very quick switch. All right, so there's teleology that comes into play here, right? So a lot of people are used to looking at certain Christian things through a fundamentalist lens, okay? Most of the women I know who go to Christ Church wear pants. Many of them have short hair. So A, there are no rules coming out. B, this has to do with teleology, right? So what is being taught is that men should be men and women should be women, and they should seek to express their masculinity and their femininity, and that there are cultural ways to do that. Now, if you look back through my archives, you can see me taking issue with a couple of things that Pastor Wilson and Pastor Sumter have said in the past about fashion, about tattoos and blue hair. And I do actually wish that some of that rhetoric were a little less heavy-handed. But even like with me wishing that we're less heavy-handed, I recognize that it's a teleological argument. No one is making rules. And women of Christ Church are walking around with gasp short hair, gasp tattoos, gasp pants.
Short hair, men shouldn't wear earrings. No one should have tattoos.
And then there was this, a psalm sing in the middle of the pandemic, protesting the local mask mandate, retweeted by then President Trump.
That was when I realized that these were not people trying to spread awareness or trying to spread the good news of Christ. It was people trying to say, look at us, we are so oppressed.
Did you feel betrayed when you realized that? How would you describe your feelings?
Yeah.
It's so interesting that they're trying to combine a rhetoric of triumphalism with we are so oppressed. Which is it? Are we triumphalists or an oppressed group? And of course, in this day and age, being oppressed is a way to power, right, to claim victim status. But please, which is it? Triumphalists or oppressed?
Yes, very betrayed, because I've grown up in the Christian church, and it never occurred to me that a church could be wrong and how wrong they could be.
They stopped attending Christ Church.
Youth.
Church. Aubrey says she was attacked online. Now they actively avoid patronizing businesses run by church members.
If it was another...
That is actually really interesting. So there is an absolute boycott war going on here. Absolutely. In both directions. And I have some videos about, things that I've overheard, conversations I've had with people. There's an absolute boycott war. Few are the neutral sites.
Church that owned it, and they just happened to have some beliefs that I didn't agree with. That's fine. But when you're hurting people, that's when you have really crossed many lines.
Are you being judged on your faith rather than your product?
I believe 100% that that's true.
Josh Flickner says he came to Moscow seeking a Christian community
My
and
friend
found
Josh.
it in Christ Church. But his business, Journey's End Cafe, is paying the price for where he worships.
I really wanted this place to be actually a bridge builder in the community. And so, yeah, it's really a bummer that that a lot of people in the community are just so full of bigotry that they do not want to even try to build those bridges.
He says his workers are threatened by crank calls and his future by a social media campaign calling out businesses run by church members.
Look at what people say about my business and then pretend like I was not a white heterosexual Christian male. That would be a hate crime. Anywhere else in the country, against any other type of person, that would be a hate crime.
3 weeks out.
Some nasty stuff. By the way, my son worked there, and this, I know for you watching, it's just more, one more piece of hearsay, but this stuff happened. And one of the things that Joshua has talked about is the fact that people would leave 5-star reviews, come back, and say, I heard from my friend that this place is owned by a cult. Again, there are not even any distinctions. It's not even like it's owned by a cult member. It's owned by a cult. Just the ignorance. But then they come back and change it to 1 star. And online reviews in this day and age make or break a business.
After this interview, Flickner announced he's closing the cafe.
So how close is Wilson to reaching his goal of turning Moscow into a Christian town? Well, no one is quite...
Okay, I just want to stop and say, him reaching his goal, that's fine. It is his goal. It's a lot of our goal. Gird your loins, babies.
sure, but everyone has an opinion.
Honestly, it's almost laughable, only because you're talking about a minute percentage of the population.
George Scandalos and Brandy Sullivan own restaurants and businesses on Main Street.
As someone who was served on the city council, I haven't seen any traction gained in that area. The last 2 elections, there were some candidates who were members of Christ Church, and those elections were very uneven.
This is actually really excellent. So I actually am of the opinion that, and some of those elections happened before we moved here. We had lived here once before, a long time ago, but I do actually think that in a lot of ways, these candidates who came up from Christ Church sort of jumped the gun. It is a small portion of the population, but it is not a minute portion of the population. Right? So we're talking about on a given Sunday, 1 in 15 people who live in Moscow, just ballparking it, are in a CREC church. That is actually enormous. It's enormous. And there are other Christians in the community. Now, one thing that definitely happened here and is happening in other arenas is that resistance is galvanized, right? And so certainly because people at Christ Church and in the CREC churches are extremely active and engaged and culturally aware, they have a disproportionate effect on things. But certainly there's not a critical mass. And by the way, the main reporter here misused the term critical mass in a, maybe it'll show up later in this video, but in that little shorter video I had watched. But yeah, so there is not the critical mass yet to, say, win elections because of the galvanization effect. But it's not a minute population at all.
And
I would call it a landslide.
there you go.
In
Yeah.
defeat.
Yeah.
That is
You have
significant. That's an
700
excellent point.
active households, about 2,000 church attendees. This is a city of 25,000 people. Is the way to reach your goal to bring in more people or to convert the hearts and minds of those
Okay, now we're getting some good questions. Excellent questions.
who already live here?
It would be both. Yeah, we would want to persuade the people who are already here, and we want to welcome the people who arrive here.
Like many other churches, Wilson's deals with accusations of sex abuse.
Okay, so before we get into this, it's very interesting, like she said, like many other churches. So one thing that has affected how many people have always sought to move here. I say always, for 20 years, 25, they have, sought to move here to sort of be in a culture, a Christian school that we dig, etc. But the pandemic kerfuffle, that has absolutely exploded. People are moving here in droves and even putting the economy under stress. But it's not because of anything that Christchurch is really doing. Some of that rhetoric has changed because there's sort of the view that we're taking in refugees. Right? They don't want to be in California or Massachusetts anymore. So there's sort of an accepting refugees mindset. But this explosion has happened because of all the COVID stuff. People who are aware of all the stuff that's happening here, but were fine where they were until they were no longer fine where they were. Okay, let's continue.
Including a deacon this summer pleading guilty to a federal charge of child pornography, and Wilson marrying a released child molester to a church member.
So I'll just say quickly that I have a video on this too, and that there's a channel called All My Friends Are Heretics. So All My Friends Are Heretics. I'll try to remember to post the link below, in which you can find Wilson talking in detail about that second thing that was brought up, about marrying a sex offender to somebody.
The thing that upsets people is not the child molestation offense, because there are 20, 30 sex offenders in Moscow, and everybody knows the name of one of them because of where he goes to church. Right? The ones who don't go to church, they're all okay. They stay out of the newspapers. But the one who is repentant and wants to live right and is, straightened out, we're going to go after him because this is because the target is actually me.
Wilson, if anything, seems energized by the criticism and attention and undeterred from his goal.
That is something I find quite remarkable about him. And I love that is sort of seen as a sinister thing, like it's all about me. I actually think it is remarkable that when faced with so many personal attacks, he does in fact seem to be galvanized. And I can't actually imagine the cost it must demand of him.
Do you see expanding this microcosm from Moscow to the full United States?
It's hard to envision how that might happen. I think it would be wonderful if it did. So if there were a reformation and a revival, that's something we pray for regularly.
I mean, listen to how Christian he sounds. And a distinction was drawn, maybe drawn later here, in the very short little clip between him and some movement of, Trumpist American flag in the worship service people in Tennessee. This is the rhetoric of the church in previous times and places.
And if what is happening here caught fire and spread elsewhere,
Reformation and revival.
Very, very grateful.
We're going to look at how these dynamics are playing out in our national politics and how the forces of Christian nationalism are likely to impact where we are headed with both political parties. Next.
Okay, I'm going to pause the video for a little bit because, it's we're halfway through the video itself, and hopefully there will be some good stuff worth watching here, but I'm not sure a panel will be great content. So I'm going to take a little sneak peek ahead, have a glass of water, and I'll see you guys shortly. Okay, y'all. Well, I just stepped outside. My wife had apparently just finished watching the entire thing. So there we were in separate rooms watching this, but she was ahead of me. I'm not going to do the panel. I'm sure there's plenty of interesting stuff there, but all it is just the panel, and what's going on here specifically only comes up a couple more times. She did make a snarky remark, my wife that is, who, by the way, is wearing pants, and my daughter was wearing shorts when I went out there. Gasp, I'm going to have to put the smack down, I guess. All right, so she made a snarky remark about how they showed the psalm sing right after this couple said what they said about tattoos, etc. So let's just have a look at that before I end the video.
Or something for the school, you get very swept up in all of it.
Until they heard this message from another pastor in the church.
Women should wear women's clothes. They shouldn't wear pants.
Shouldn't have short hair.
Shouldn't have short hair. Men shouldn't wear earrings. No one should have tattoos.
And then there was this.
Okay.
A psalm sing in the middle of the pandemic.
I can't believe I didn't
protesting
catch
the local
this.
mask mandate.
That is happening.
Retweeted by then.
Stop. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Women shouldn't wear pants? Is that the deal? Women shouldn't have short hair? Look at the woman on the left. The woman on the left works at the church. She has short hair. Look at all those pants. In fact, I don't see a dress or skirt. Goodness gracious.
No one should have tattoos.
And then...
Look at all those pants. By the way, I know several women at Christchurch who have tattoos. Now, again, there's a teleological argument being made. I already unpacked that a little bit, but please take a look at the actual people. Okay, so that's it for me. I hope that you found this a useful reaction. The peace of Christ be upon you.
What day is it today? Remind me.
It's Sunday, Mr. Pinch.
Sunday. And what do we do on a Sunday morning, wherever we happen to be? We go to church, you bloody heathen!